Hello, everyone. I'm Dina, your moderator for the first part of today's event. We have an exciting lineup of speakers and topics, so let's get started. If you have a question, please remember to use the chat, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible during the Q&A sessions. Now, let me introduce our first speaker, Deepansh Kurana, a true data enthusiast who thrives on the thrill of uncovering insights through exploratory analysis backed up by, guess what, R and Python. With his passion for coding, art, and self-improvement, Deepansh is here to share his journey of crafting a personalized API using R, AWS, and Plumber for, drumroll please, life hacking. So let's try and get inspired and empowered to create our own customized solutions with Deepansh. Deepansh, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dina, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to share this project, and wow, I'm just blown away by all that you said, actually. So I'm now more pumped and excited. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Deepansh Khurana. I'm an R Shiny developer at Epsilon, and the title of my talk is How I Built an API for My Life and How You Can Too. So before we begin, I have to tell you two things about myself. I read a lot of books. I have always read a lot of books, and I like making things for myself. So these two things are the most important things in my life. And before we begin, there's time for a story. About a year ago, I wanted to track all my finances. I wanted to see where everything was going, how much money was increasing or decreasing. And I could not find a great solution because I realized all the apps were bloated with features and they would definitely sell my data. And these two things just did not sit well with me. So I figured, why not create your own? And so I built an app called Ebenezer, named after the miserly Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. And I became an expert in quant overnight, as we often do. But then something happened. 2 or 3 weeks later, I wanted to plan a trip, and I realized Google had sunset the trip summaries in Google Travel. Of course, it's Google because they keep sunsetting things. And then I made another app called Livingston, which was named after Jonathan Livingston Seagull, another character from a fable. And then I had a vision. What if there was a platform and an API or an app or a dashboard where I could see my financial highlights from Ebenezer, number of trips incoming from Livingston, and maybe something about my fitness, something about the tasks that I was due to complete on, and came along Hrafnagud, or Raven God, named after Odin, the all-seeing Norse god. And building things for yourself, in my opinion, is a very lonely process. And there is something I want to share before we begin. And here's a comment I left for myself some time ago on an app that I was working on. And it says, whenever you get a chance to work on this, remember, you need to find a way to get the file details and the table data. Once you do that, you will need to make the table selectable. And once that is done, the next steps will magically make sense to you, and you will thank the wonders of how human memory works. But you need to do the first step first. Otherwise, you will be lost at sea. I immediately shared this screenshot with all of my friends, and 50% of them, I would say, really found funny, and 50% called me insane, which I think is a good measure of what we're about to see. And this is the fruit of my labor. In the center, you can see the the Hrafnagud dashboard, which says what my net worth is, how many trips are incoming. You can also see on the desktop version, we also have a weather widget, just to make it more presentable. And there's a tasks, which is not even done yet, which says work in progress, named after Phileas Fogg from Around the World in 80 Days, who was known for his meticulous planning. And since I needed a place to edit data, who better to name it after the Greek giant with eyes all over his body called Argus Panoptus. And as you can see, all these apps have mobile versions because I really wanted to access them whenever I wanted to. And these are built in Rhino and built in Shiny. There is nothing that a little CSS cannot achieve, let me tell you that. So on a high level, This is how it started. Two apps taking data from Google Sheets using Google Sheets for R, nothing complicated. And then as I started to grow this project, it became a data layer, Amazon DynamoDB, Google Sheets, and the entire internet for APIs, for web scraping, and so on and so forth, which then goes into an Amazon EC2 instance running a Plumber on a PM2 task manager, which has CRUD operations for DynamoDB, custom APIs, crawlers, and so on. And then there's a container of ShinyProxy by AWS on DigitalOcean, where each application is a Docker container. And this architecture, I would say, is an infinitely extensible personal app architecture. The ... there indicates that you can add as many apps and as many APIs to this. Now a question comes to mind, why I did not deploy things on either the entirety of AWS or the entirety of DigitalOcean. Why split it up? And let me tell you, when you try to build things for yourself, you take the path of least resistance. And I found a droplet by AWS for ShinyProxy on DigitalOcean. It wasn't there on AWS, and I just figured, hey, this saves me tons of time, so why not do that? And now we can start diving into the endpoints. There are 5 CRUD operations, the 4 for the create, read, update, and delete, and 1 for getting the schema from DynamoDB. There are 2 endpoints called Midas, which are for Boolean prices that I'll talk about in a bit. Midas is, of course, the king who turned everything to gold, fitting for Boolean prices. Then we have Robin, which is the ticker API or the stocks API that I will also share in a bit. And of course, it's named after the great Robin Hood. And then there's 3 endpoints for Livingston, and there are 14 for Ebenezer. So I really had to do a lot of deep layer wrangling there to just get the data that I needed. But now let's go under the hood. Chapter 1, Ebenezer. The 3 little pieces of Ebenezer are financial calculations. As I mentioned, I became a quant overnight. So, I had to figure out everything by myself, learn how stocks are calculated, learn how every single piece of math is done behind the scenes on all the platforms that we see. And then there's a Google Finance API. Now, let me tell you about Google Finance. There is no such API that exists. All the finance APIs in the world are made for enterprises, and they cost a ton. They would have cost more than the money I would have tracked, actually. So I figured, why not make your own Google Finance API? And then the third is Boolean prices, as I talked about Midas. So how does the finance API work? Well, if you know Google Sheets, you know there's a formula called Google Finance, which lets you enter any ticker from any market in the world and get the current price, the change percent, and all the other attributes that you really need. Well, we have the data in a sheet. What can we do about it? We have Google Sheets for R, so we can get the data into R. But hey, why stop there and why not push it into Plumber? And this is how you make your own API, because an API is essentially an endpoint you hit to get your own data. So this is as simple as creating a finance API from scratch. But hey, don't tell Google about this. And Boolean prices is not as straightforward. The thing is, Boolean and especially gold in India has a very different set of pricing configured for it. The price changes from state to state. There are prices for bonds, and then there are prices for something called MMTC, which is the digital form of gold. So of course, getting the price isn't as straightforward as a query in Google Sheets. But hey, we can always harvest some data, can't we? And this is a function that I wrote for 2 of these prices, where I go to a website and I basically just scrape the data that I need. I push it back into Plumber, and I get my own Midas endpoints, which give me the price for the Booleans and the price for MMTC gold. And this then plugs up into my finance API, which gives me all the current rates for the bonds and all the current money that I maybe have accumulated. Now, a note of caution, if you go with this approach, this is a personal project which I access maybe once or twice a day, or maybe sometimes once in a week. And then hitting a website with the Plumber API is fine. But the etiquette of scraping suggests that if it's going to be used by many users, you better watch and you better not follow this approach, because, well, you would be putting someone else's website down for no reason. Moving on to the next chapter, Livingston. Now with Livingston, the API is simple. You kind of have a data for trips, you have a database for details in the trips, and that's it. So the more important part is, how do you create a card, which is a clickable div in Shiny? And then how do you make a feed, which is many of these divs? So the app is structured in such a way that you have all the trips in a feed, and then you click any trip, and then you get details. And the details can include anything from flights to your transportation to cafes to restaurants to so on and so forth. And this basically shows you an entire itinerary of your trip. So how do I make a clickable div in Shiny and Rhino? Well, there's nothing a little JS cannot solve. And shiny.setInputValue is a function that is already available to you. What it does is it makes an input without a widget or an input widget like select input or something along those lines. So you can get an observe event triggered just by a click event. Now, what this little piece of code does is it lets you click a card, get the target ID, which is already on the card, and then send it to something called app-selected_trip. And the app comes from Rhino. Because this is triggered in the main.r and Rhino appends an app namespace to the main, this will make writing this observe event a piece of cake. So every single time a card is clicked, input $selected trip is changed and observe event triggers. But now, how do I make so many of these? Well, let's take an example of the details feed. And there's a simple function called makeDetailsDiv, which takes in all of these lists of data. And let me tell you with a quick detour about sunk cost fallacy and technical debt. You try to make something work, it works, it looks dirty. Clearly, as you can see on the screen, this could have been a data frame, and it is a data frame. But somehow it worked with the lists, and I could not figure out to make it work with the data frame in time. And the code has remained like this ever since. So technical debt is an impossible challenge to solve. But for now, this works. And how do you make multiple of these divs? You can use a map function. So you pass all the data with this function, and you get all the divs that you really need. Now, there is another challenge. Let's assume all of these apps are made. They look really great. All the APIs work. The spirit of this project was securing my own data. And of course, I have ShinyProxy. So the data is secured as long as it's in the app. But how do I secure the API? And to be honest, I had no clue about this. I really had no idea. But hey, when in doubt, Stack Overflow. And there is an exact answer to do this on Stack Overflow to exactly add authentication to the Plumber UI. And this worked for me, but not exactly because of the way I was defining Plumber. Now, Plumber has two different ways to define the APIs. One is just using the function, and one is using our Oxygen 2 doc strings to define all the endpoints and the details. We'll see that in a bit anyway, so no need to worry about if you haven't experienced anything with Plumber yet. And I had to write a little auth helper for me, which was, I don't know how I even figured this out, but there is something called an RES and an REQ in Plumber, which is the response and the request. And these are reserved variables for any single endpoint that you create. So you can actually use these to modify some things. And my favorite part about R is the dot list and passing functions. So if you know, you can always pass a function into one of the function, and then you can pass a dot list for those parameters. And this is what I do. I basically check if the request has the key, if the key is valid, or the environment is not set. And then if any of those are true, I return an error message with a 401, unauthorized. And if everything looks good and in order, I run the function with the dot list passed. Let's see an example of reading data from a table. So I define the Plumber endpoint. I give the two parameters, table name and limit. Limit basically tells DynamoDB how many rows to send. And then the endpoint is called /read, and the tag is CRUD. The tag is basically which group of APIs will it land up in the OpenAPI documentation. So the function is basically a wrapper over auth helper, and it calls this function called get process table data, which is something similar to final version 1 and final version 2. If you're a designer, you would know about this. So it was table data, process table data, get process table data, and that's how it goes. If you have made functions, you would know about this anyway. So It passes the table name, it passes the limit, and then it gets me the data with the authentication intact. But hey, let's look at this in action. You get the school authorized button on your Swagger docs in Plumber. And securing the API, you can actually demo the API by clicking this authorize, adding the API key. If everything is in order, everything works. And if nothing is in order, then you would basically get no output and keep getting 401s. When you send the request, you append the API key in another parameter in the header, and you basically get all the output that you need. Okay, that's a lot of code, and now we can bring it together. That sounds very corporate, doesn't it? Bringing it all together. Let's try to make it fun. I added a greeting message to the app. If you notice, if you remember, it said hi Deepansh and with an emoji. And this is as simple as sending two vectors with three different greetings and three different emoji and just randomizing them on the fly. So this is how it looks like. Every single time I open the app, I get a new greeting. So this kind of makes things fun and adds to a cool UX because personal projects, again, are all about fun. And another thing that I've added is Odin's many names. You could not see it on the screenshot, but of course, when the app is inspired by Odin, I wanted to add something. So I added something to the footer with a similar mechanism. I have a list of all the names that Odin is known for in mythology. And then I added all the different combinations and started printing it in the footer. Now let's go for some reflections. There was a lot of learning, and I mean a lot. I encourage you making personal projects because everything that I learned here, I was applying in the projects that I was working on at work. And I definitely am a firm believer of making things for yourself. Sunk cost fallacy is a real thing. Sunk cost fallacy can attack you. Technical debt is sunk cost fallacy. I learned about something called Supabase later, and Supabase is basically a better replacement for the DynamoDB part that I did. So I could not change it in time, but well, we were there. Was it frustrating? Yes. Is it frustrating? Yes. I'm always tinkering things. I always find something is broken. But was it worth it? Also, yes, absolutely. Every single time I open this app, every single time I get my data on the fly, it is amazing that I can get all of that as soon as I want it, whenever I want it, with security that I really needed and all the features I wanted to. And coming to the end, a thought for the road. If your ideal solution does not exist, make it yourself. But hey, here's something to help you out. If you go to this GitHub link, you'll find two branches, main and the branch.personal. In the main, you'll find the CredOps, the API written for you, so you can begin right now. And if you want to refer to my code, that is public too. And I think with that, I could call it a close. I hope you enjoyed this speed run of 1 year of development. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepansh. That was a speed run, but everybody's got a limited time here because we want to delve into as much as possible, right? And I agree with Tim, who commented that the middleware gets the job done. Let's get it recognized, right? But for me, you hit home hard with a mythology and folklore context. I would toss a coin. Anyways, there is a cool question that we got in the chat. The question from Jeff Craigie. So, would JS be preferable than R file with JavaScript made with glue?
I'm a proponent of keeping things where they are. So I would actually like to put JS code in JS file, put R code in an R file. But if push comes to shove, and if you really, really need to, put something and make a glue string out of it, make a JS string out of a glue string, I would say go for it. If it works, you should go for it.
Okay. Okay, guys, sharing links. So I also see that, can we mark it as a question that Karen Byron says that it would be so cool to add output fitness monitors like Apple Watch, I guess with RVest.
Exactly. So the next thing that I really want to add to this is, and I'm sorry, I'm not an Apple person, I'm more of a Google person. So I have my Google Fit data, I have my Fitbit data, and the next thing that I really want to add to this is something called Athena, and that would basically be all the fitness data that I have. and that would be another box. So I think it's infinitely extensible, and you can always add more things to it. So this is why I really wanted to build this, and this is where I encourage you to come and look at my code, build things, and maybe share it with me, so I can add more things to the app.
Okay, this is great. And we are so perfect on time. I don't see any more questions coming in, but guys, if you have any more questions, you can connect with Deepansh, you can use our Slack channel, and we get back to you with the answers. Thanks, Deepansh, again. And we'll be moving on to the next speaker.